Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? You know I love when you all send in your suggestions, and this one intrigued me. This piece from Exploring History on Medium. How violent were the Mongols, really? I mean, it's a question historians have debated forever. So today we're going to try to, unpack that a little, see what we find.
Yeah, well, this article is a good one. It doesn't sugarcoat the Mongols' brutal side, but it also asks us to think deeper,
Yeah.
about the strategy behind all that, the thinking.
It really does make you reconsider that image we have of them as just bloodthirsty barbarians. Like the article calls it the Mongol paradox. They were super violent, but also brilliant strategists. How does that even work?
Right, it's a total contradiction.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes them so fascinating to study. This civilization built a huge empire, one of the biggest ever, and they were known for, well, destruction. How does that even happen?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher. And one thing the article points out is how they used terror, like it was a weapon in itself.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. They were masters of psychological warfare. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. Their reputation often preceded them. So just the thought of the Mongols approaching was often enough to encourage surrender, made things easier for them.
It's like a brutal cost-benefit analysis. The article even uses the Siege of Otrar as an example. This city held out for 5 months against them. You'd think they'd be wiped out, but the Mongols spared the commoners and the artisans.
See, that's the thing. They weren't just mindless killers. They needed those skilled workers
Mm.
to, keep the empire running smoothly, build things. So wiping everyone out wouldn't have made sense for them in the long run.
So it wasn't indiscriminate killing, it was more calculated.
Right. The article's argument is that their violence, it was tied to the level of resistance they met. Like surrender quickly, less bloodshed, resist. Well, face the full force of their wrath.
A pretty effective system, huh? They give the example of Herat, a city that surrendered right away and stayed mostly intact. And then there's Nishapur, where a Mongol commander was killed. That city was completely destroyed.
Yeah, Nishapur is a good example of how seriously they took any threat to their leadership. It was a message to everyone else. Don't mess with us, challenge our authority, and this is what happens.
Makes you wonder about the psychological impact, you know? Having your entire city wiped out, even in war, it's hard to imagine recovering from something like that.
Definitely raises questions about the long-term effects of violence and the whole idea of rebuilding after something so traumatic. It's something historians are still trying to understand, even today.
The article spends a lot of time on the Khwarezm campaign, which seems like the peak of this whole brutal system. What was it about that campaign that was so violent, even for the Mongols?
Well, there were a few things. It basically boils down to some major miscalculations and provocations that really set them off.
Yeah, the article mentions the execution of those Mongol merchants as the starting point. The Shah of Khwarez saw them as spies, had them killed. Apparently, the Mongols saw that as a huge insult, a violation of diplomacy.
Remember, trade and diplomacy were really important to them. That execution was a direct attack on their authority, on their system. So it demanded a strong response.
And then the Shah, he didn't stop there. Instead of uniting his forces, he spread them out in different garrisons. Like, he basically played right into the Mongols' hands, didn't he?
Huge tactical blunder. That fragmented defense, it let the Mongols, who were masters of mobility and speed, pick them apart one by one. It was a recipe for disaster.
So from their point of view, it was a diplomatic insult, followed by a strategic mistake, like an open invitation to unleash everything they had.
Exactly. And what followed was one of the most brutal chapters in their history. Sieges, conquests, all driven by revenge, and a need to prove a point to anyone who defied them.
The details are pretty intense, but even within this campaign, it seems like their violence wasn't always, the same level. It's almost like they were, I don't know, experimenting with the system of theirs, seeing how far they could push it.
Right, it's what makes studying them so complex. There's this brutality, but it's intertwined with their goals, their economics, even personal grudges.
So it wasn't just about destruction, it was about building and maintaining power, right?
Absolutely. And by looking at these specific examples, we can start to see the logic behind it, the chilling calculus of their conquests.
So let's get into some specific examples from that campaign, see how this all played out. The article does a good job of, laying out these scenarios, like showing how they applied this whole reward and punishment system. We talked about Otrar already, how they spared those artisans after the siege. Maybe we can start there.
Yeah, Ochar is a perfect example of their practical side.
Hmm.
5 months they besieged that city. They could have easily leveled the whole thing.
Hmm.
But those skilled workers, the blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, all those were valuable to them. You
Yeah.
need people like that to keep an empire going, especially one that's growing as fast as theirs was.
It almost doesn't make sense, right? You think of this powerful force, and you'd assume they'd be all about brute strength, not economics.
Right. But that's that paradox again.
Hmm.
They knew real power wasn't just about military might. It was about building something that lasts, something that works. And that required, well, a bit more finesse.
So, Ochar, that's the reward side, I guess. Submit, and maybe you get spared, or at least treated with some practicality. What about the punishment? The article talks about Nishapur, and that's a much darker story.
Yeah, Nishapur, that was a statement. When they felt their authority was challenged directly, like with that commander, Tugchar,
Yeah.
being killed during the siege, it wasn't just a military loss. It was personal. And the response, well, it was meant to be devastating.
The article mentions his widow, who
Yeah.
was Genghis Khan's daughter. She was a big part of what happened after. It adds another layer to it, right? It wasn't just strategy. It was about revenge, family honor, all those things.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they were calculating,
Yeah.
but they were also driven by loyalty, this idea of justice, their version of it anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that personal element, it probably played a big part in how Nishapur was destroyed.
Makes you think, though, about the ripple effects. A whole city wiped out, all those lives lost. It goes beyond just the strategic stuff. It's a trauma that lasts.
It does. And it makes us think about the real cost of war, how it affects people, families, whole communities for generations.
Let's look at another one, Gurganj. They put up a tough fight, right? The article talks about how the Mongols used this crazy tactic to take the city.
Oh, yeah, Gurganj. That shows how adaptable they were. They diverted a river to flood the city. It was brilliant, strategically and ruthless,
Yeah.
honestly. But it shows their ingenuity, their commitment to, overcoming any obstacle in their way.
Resourceful and ruthless. That's a good way to put it. They really did use whatever they had to get what they wanted.
And yet, even with Gurganj, even after flooding the city, they still spared a lot of the artisans. That practicality comes up again.
So even when they were flooding cities, they were still thinking about the future, the need for those skilled workers to keep things running. It's a complicated picture.
It is. And it challenges that simple idea we might have of them as just bloodthirsty. Their actions, yeah, brutal, but they were tied to their goals,
Yeah.
to economics, and as we saw with Nishapur, sometimes to personal vendettas too.
Okay, last one from the article, bulk. They surrendered peacefully at first, no bloodshed, but then things changed.
Balg, it's a good reminder of how fragile peace could be with them and how important loyalty was. When the citizens rebelled, kicked out the Mongol governor, it was seen as a betrayal. They broke that trust, and that meant no more peaceful coexistence.
It was like they were giving a choice: submit and be part of the empire, or resist and be destroyed. No middle ground.
Yeah, that was a key part of it. They were willing to integrate different cultures, religions, all that,
Mhm.
but under one condition: total obedience. Any rebellion, and the response was swift and brutal.
So we've got Utrar, Nishapur, Gurganj, Balk. It paints a pretty clear picture, right? The violence, yeah, it was awful, but it wasn't random. It was a tool, something they used strategically to keep control, punish those who defied them, and maybe most importantly, prevent future rebellions.
Exactly. You start to see past the brutality, and there's this logic behind it. Their empire wasn't just built on fear. It was a whole system. Rewards, punishments, all designed to create order, to make sure they stayed on top.
It's a chilling picture, but it makes you think about power. The
Yeah.
compromises that come with building an empire and the effects of violence, even when it's strategic, those effects last a long time.
It does, and it raises questions that are still relevant today. How do we reconcile the great things civilizations achieve with the brutal ways they often do it? How do we learn from the past without, condoning what happened? Tough questions, but worth asking.
Definitely a lot to process. It's important to engage with that stuff, though, right? To learn and try to create a future where power is used responsibly, where human life is valued above all else.
Couldn't agree more. And studying the Mongols, as challenging as it is, it gives us a chance to think about those things, those fundamental questions.
We've talked a lot about the violence, the strategy, all that. But their legacy isn't just about war, right? Their empire. It was this huge network, trade, cultural exchange, ideas flowing all over the place. Maybe we can shift gears a bit and talk about that side of things.
Yeah, good point. It's easy to focus on the destruction, but they did have a lasting impact beyond the battlefield. They connected the world in ways that hadn't been done before.
Yeah, it's wild to think about, right? This group, known for their armies, their brutality, they end up connecting all these different parts of the world. I mean, the article we've been looking at focuses on the violence, but I'd love to dig into that other side, the impact they had beyond the battlefield.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big part of their story that sometimes gets lost in all the fighting and conquest. Their empire, when it was at its peak, it stretched from East Asia all the way to Eastern Europe. That's huge.
Hmm.
And it created this network, trade routes, communication lines, stuff that had never existed on that scale before.
The Pax Mongolica, right, that's what they called it. It sounds kind of peaceful, which is, well, a little ironic considering how they got there.
Yeah, a bit of a paradox, huh? But the thing is, that stability, even though it came from, well, brutal force, it did create a situation where things could move more freely. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, travelers, they could all move through this vast territory with, a certain level of safety. It led to this explosion of trade and cultural exchange.
So they weren't trying to be like cultural ambassadors, but they ended up creating the conditions for a more connected world.
Exactly. And that led to a lot of interaction, blending of cultures, stuff that you wouldn't have seen otherwise.
I've also read that they were surprisingly pretty tolerant when it came to religion. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Mongols themselves were mostly shamanistic, but they had this policy of religious tolerance throughout the empire. So you had Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, even Confucianism, all coexisting, even flourishing in some cases.
That's pretty amazing when you think about all the religious conflict that was happening in other parts of the world at that time. Was that just for practicality, or was there something more to it?
It was probably a mix of things. Practically speaking, forcing one religion on such a huge, diverse empire, that would have been almost impossible. And probably would have caused more problems. Tolerance is just easier, kept things running smoothly,
Like, believe what you want, just pay your taxes and don't rebel.
right, basically.
Yeah.
But there's also some evidence that they were genuinely curious about other religions, too. They invited religious leaders from all kinds of faiths to their court for debates, discussions, all that. So they were open to different perspectives, in a way.
So not just trade, culture, but religious dialogue too, huh?
Yeah, it was a really interesting time. Lots of ideas, beliefs flowing back and forth across these huge distances. It had a big impact.
What about technology? Did they make any, big advances in that area?
They weren't really known for inventing new stuff, but they were amazing at adapting, integrating things from other cultures. They'd conquer a place, see something they liked, and boom, they'd incorporate it into their own society, their military.
The article mentioned gunpowder, for example. They got that from China, right?
Exactly. And they weren't shy about using it, but they also picked up things like siege warfare techniques from the Chinese, administrative systems from Persia, even metalworking methods from Europe. They were always on the lookout for ways to, make their empires stronger, more effective.
Like the Silicon Valley of the 13th century, always looking for the next big thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah, kind of. But seriously, that ability to absorb and use things from different cultures, that was huge for them.
Okay, so we've talked about the connections, the exchange of culture, religion, technology. But we can't forget the other side, right? The violence, the suffering, all that. It's part of their legacy, too.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that. Millions died because of their conquests. Cities were destroyed. Even when they spared people, they often forced them to move, which,
Yeah.
tore apart communities, caused a lot of hardship.
It shows that even empires that are, connected, cosmopolitan, all that, they can still be built on violence, oppression.
Very true. The Pax Mongolica, with all the good things that came with it, it was still based on military power, on that threat of brutal force. It's a complicated legacy, no doubt about it.
Makes you think about how we view history in general, doesn't it? It's not always clear-cut, good versus evil, all that. It's about understanding those complexities, the good and the bad, trying to see the whole picture.
Absolutely. And the Mongols, they really force us to do that. This mix of brutality and innovation, it's hard to wrap your head around sometimes.
So as we wrap this up, what are the big takeaways here? Why does this story, this group from centuries ago, why does it matter today?
I think they teach us about power, about how empires rise and fall, about the choices we make and the effects those choices have. They remind us that the past is always with us, shaping who we are, influencing the world we live in.
It's a story that keeps people fascinated, and it makes us ask some tough questions about our own history, the decisions we make, both as individuals and as, a global community.
And it shows how interconnected things are, how civilizations influence each other. And it reminds us that that search for peace, for justice, for a better world, that's something that's always been there throughout history.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's a fascinating period of history, but it's also, unsettling. It makes you reconsider things, challenge your assumptions about everything.
It's been great exploring this with you.
And thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the Mongols. Hope you learned something and maybe, got inspired to keep digging into history. There's always more to discover, right? Until next time, I'm